In his excellent book on the Finnish War, Professor Martin Hårdstedt begins by giving us a view into the end, not just of the war, but also of a nation. It is the 8th of October, 1809. On the courtyard outside of Umeå church, the soldiers of what up until then had been the Finnish part of the Swedish army stood lined up. The 1.5 years of war was all too visible on them all, the uniforms torn and bloodied, many injured and invalids. They now had to return to a new Finland, now a grand duchy under the Russian Tsar. What was left of their homes or their families they did not know. Opposite them on the courtyard stood newly recruited life grenadiers from the Swedish part of the army, all in shiny uniforms. In front of them all stood a man that we will talk a lot more about later in this story, Major General Carl-Georg von Döbeln. Von Döbeln turned to the Finnish part of the army. "Soldiers, comrades, brothers, you who, during the recently concluded war, despite the enemy army's numerical superiority and superiority in weapons, still faithfully and bravely defeated the enemy at Sikkojoki, Revolax, Pulkkila, Lappo, Juutas. You who, on your own, reclaimed half of Finland. You who were finally forced by a vastly superior force to leave the Finnish border. Since then you have steadfastly fought for the Swedish soil of the motherland. You who stand here are the highly esteemed remnants of the proud Finnish nation and its valiant warriors. It is you that I convey the sincere gratitude of the King, the Parliament, the Swedish people, the Swedish army, my predecessors, my fellow countrymen, myself, indeed, everyone's sincere gratitude. Finns, brothers, your achievements are great, and to express what we feel requires the full ability of an eloquent speaker. But I am just a soldier." Von Döbeln then turned to the Swedish side of the army. "Swedes, be proud that you have seen these Finnish troops. Remember them, honor them. See their exhausted bodies, their pale faces. They bear the marks of their faithful but still fruitless efforts over the years to liberate their homeland. Finns, you return to your hometowns with worn-out clothes, with limbs either shot through or amputated. We wish to bless you from generation to generation. Honor you. I ask you that when you approach the places where we have defeated our enemies, and you see the miserable sand heaps that cover our fallen comrades, bless their land. They have died as heroes. Finns, brothers, if these words could be sealed with tears of blood from my eyes, they would flow, and every drop would assure you of my reverence, my friendship." And with those words from von Döbeln, a nation united for 600 years had ceased to exist. So, today we will talk about the lead up to that war and why it came to be. In 1805, when Gustav Adolf took Sweden to war in the War of the Third Coalition, he did so as a near absolute monarch. At that point, the powers of the monarchy were something which had been fought over between the monarch and the parliament for almost 100 years. This struggle, in of itself, is also a large part of what motivated Gustav Adolf to declare war on France. When his father, Gustav III, came to the throne in February of 1771, the power of the monarchy was all but completely eroded, and all power was now in the hands of Parliament. Gustav, who was a major admirer of all things French, was in France when he got the news of his father's passing. His mother was a sister of Prussia's Frederick the Great, and a great admirer of her brother's power. She had tried and failed to overthrow parliamentary power for her husband, and had since egged on her son to try the same. With this background, it was natural that Gustav had thought about a possible self-coup ever since he was young. When he traveled back home, he went to visit his uncle in Berlin, who warned him against any coup attempts. A warning most likely because of political reasons. As it was now standing, with a powerful parliament, it was possible for Prussia to influence decisions through bribes to corrupt parliamentarians. So the decision Gustav now took to overthrow the ruling order was one made knowing that the dangers were not only internal, but a coup would also immediately put Sweden in a tough strategic positions, with enemies at all its borders. The coup was carried out a year later. The plan for the coup was that loyal officers would seize the newly almost finished fortress at Sveaborg, which contained the majority of the archipelago fleet. Both the fort, which was likely the strongest in Sweden at the time, and the fleet, specialized for combined army and navy operations in the shallow Baltic Sea, were inventions of the genius Augustin Ehrensvärd. It was also Ehrensvärd's prodigy, Colonel Jakob Magnus Sprängboten, who was to take over the forces at the fort and sail them to Stockholm. The plan was not very well concealed though, and one person who picked up on it was the young officer Johan Christopher Toll. Toll had lost his position when the ruling parties had switched at the last parliamentary elections. He now offered to complement the coup plans by going himself to the fortress town of Kristianstad in the south, and there take command of the garrison and march it towards Stockholm. Gustav agreed to this and gave Toll a letter from himself to deliver to the leadership of the garrison. Toll's actions are also what would kick off the coup. Everything went according to plan, and he quickly got the garrison to swear allegiance to the king. Soon the only opposition to the royalists were a local priest who proclaimed he would use his next sermon to rally opinion against the coup. To deal with this, Toll had a cannon placed on a nearby square and aimed it against the church windows, inside of which the priest would give his sermon. He then placed himself in the doorway of the church with a white handkerchief visible in his hand. This threat made the priest back down. But Parliament still managed to find out what was going on, and it was now a race for who could get troops to the capital first to secure the king. In Sveaborg everything was delayed, and Toll had a long way to go to Stockholm. In this moment the king acted himself. When he realized the gig was up, he went to the officers of the royal guard, gave a speech that made them swear loyalty to him, and then had the opposition arrested. The new parliament, gathered under the will of the king, approved a new constitution that reinstituted massive powers for the monarchy. Critically though, the new constitution did not give the king the right to unilaterally declare war. As predicted, the new constitution immediately made all Sweden's neighbors into potential enemies, and an alliance between Denmark, Norway and Russia meant that Sweden now faced a two-front war. Gustav invested heavily in the army and the navy, especially the latter got a new modern class of 10 ships of the line and 10 frigates, all designed by Fredrik Henrik of Chapman, who revolutionized serial production of warships in Sweden. The new building techniques meant that all 20 ships were built in 3 years. In 1788, the king saw the time as right for an offensive war against Russia, but the law still forbade the king to start wars. To work around this, Gustav opted for a false flag attack. In the night between the 27th and 28th of June, Swedish soldiers, dressed as Russian Cossacks, attacked the Swedish border post, triggering a war. The overall plan for the war had been drafted by Toll and was simple but bold. In basic terms, the plan could be divided into 7 steps. 1. Wait for a war between the Russians and the Ottomans. 2. Hold off until a large portion of the Russian Baltic fleet sails for the Mediterranean. 3. Defeat the remaining Russian fleet in the Baltic. 4. Use the Finnish army to attack southeast in the direction of St. Petersburg to engage the Russian defenders. 5. Transport the Swedish army across the Gulf of Finland and land in Oranienbaum outside of St. Petersburg. 6. Storm the Russian capital and capture the Empress. 7. Dictate peace terms. But as always, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The Russians did go to war with the Ottomans, and a squadron from the Russian Baltic fleet were sent to the Mediterranean, but it was here that things started to go wrong. In this case, when the Swedish High Seas Fleet, under the command of the king's brother Carl, the future Carl XIII, sailed out towards Finland, it actually met the Russian squadron heading out of the Baltic. This strange meeting made the Russians suspicious, and they instead decided to stop in Copenhagen. The following naval battle of Hoogland between the Russian and Swedish fleets ended in a hard-fought draw, which in this case was a clear loss for the Swedes, who needed a decisive victory to be able to maneuver freely towards St. Petersburg. With that, the chance for a quick victory was gone. Instead, a lack of supplies and equipment for the army now started to show, and there was unrest among the officer corps. A group of officers, led by Carl Gustav Armfelt the Younger, formed what has since been dubbed as the Anjala conspiracy, after the house where it was agreed. The conspiracy sought to end the war unilaterally, by negotiating peace with the Russian Empress directly. The conspiracy was eventually suppressed, and Armfelt later died in prison, serving a life sentence. But it showed that the times when royal power was unchecked were now gone. With a drawn-out war in Finland now a fact, Denmark-Norway, as an ally of Russia, opened up a new front by invading western Sweden. The king, fresh from having suppressed the Anjala conspiracy, went to the west, and with some success organized the defense himself, by bypassing the nobility and speaking directly to the peasants. With this regained confidence, he then called a new parliament, where he used his new connection to the peasant class and the three lower houses of parliament to, against the will of the nobility, pass a new amendment to the constitution, giving the monarch even greater powers. In hindsight, it definitely seems like the king drew the wrong lesson from the Anjala conspiracy. In the end, Gustav managed to end the war with Russia as a draw, after the Swedish navy had utterly crushed the Russians at the Second Battle of Svenskund. But the dangers was not over for the king. A new conspiracy soon emerged in the nobility, possibly even at some level including the king's own brother Carl. On the 16th of March, Gustav is to attend a masquerade at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm, when he receives a letter from an anonymous person who warns him of a plot to assassinate him. In the end, the king chooses to attend anyway, not wanting to seem weak. At the masquerade, the king and his friend Henrik von Essen are surrounded by a large group of people. Suddenly shots are heard, and the king is hit. But they are not immediately fatal. Von Essen then takes command of the situation and quickly has the opera house locked up. Gustav is taken to Stockholm Palace, where he survives for almost another 2 weeks. Von Essen's quick action, and those extra 2 weeks, means that Gustav managed to secure the succession for his 14-year-old son Gustav Adolf, under a regency led by his brother Carl. The king asked one of his favorites, Gustav Maurits Armfelt, a nephew of the Armfelt who led the Anjala conspiracy, to watch over his son. But Armfelt is soon sent away to Naples as an ambassador by the new Regency Council. From Naples, Armfelt bitterly plots what has since been dubbed the Armfelt conspiracy, to use the Russian Empress to defeat the Regency Council and bring Gustavians back to power. The Armfelt family is one which is deeply connected to Finnish history, and which we will meet a lot more in our story going forward. Therefore, we will take a short time here to talk more about the family's history up till this point. Gustav Maurits Armfelt's great-grandfather was Carlolean general Carl Gustav Armfelt. In the ending phase of the Great Northern War, with Russian armies devastating Finland in what is now known as the Great Wrath, Armfelt is ordered by Charles XII to take a mostly Finnish army and join the king in his invasion of Norway. After Charles XII had died, Armfelt had to retreat with his army back across the mountains to Sweden. On this retreat, the army is caught in a storm, and more than half of the army froze to death in what is now known as the Carlolean Death March. The children of Carl Gustav later fought in the war against Russia in the 1740s, where Finland again were devastated by the Russian armies. It is with knowing this background of his father and grandfather's times one should judge the actions of Carl Gustav Armfelt the Younger during the Anjala conspiracy. He saw the devastation that might yet again come upon Finland for the political whims of a king, and chose to be a traitor instead. But for his nephew, Gustav Maurits, it was ever only about absolute loyalty to the monarchy. And when faced with the reality of Finland's separation from Sweden in 1809, Gustav Maurits will play a pivotal role in convincing the Russian Tsar to make Finland an autonomous Grand Duchy.